Hello. In this episode of the A is for Architecture podcast, I got to speak to two scholars, Derek Jones and James Benedict Brown, who with Elizabeth Boling, James Corazzo, Colin M and Nicole Lotz have written Studio Properties, a field guide to design education, published by Bloomsbury and available as an open access book on the Bloomsbury website. Studio Properties treats the design studio not as a singular entity, but as a landscape made up of many interlocking properties. In the book, the authors unpack each property with examples and useful insights for tutors, instructors and scholars to better understand how the studio functions, or fails, in different contexts. It's a reference tool, and our conversation touches on some of these references to try to get a sense of what the studio is, how it works, and how we might do it better.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of A is for Architecture. I'm talking today to James Benedict Brown and Derek Jones. Thank you for being here. You are representatives of a wider collective. And we're going to be talking today about your recent book, Studio Properties, a field guide to design education, which you published with Bloomsbury. Thank you for being here. James, Derek, as per, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself? And maybe, without stepping on their toes, also your co-authors.
Derek should go first as the initiator of this project.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it is my fault. I'm entirely to blame. I have to put my hand up to it. Maybe I think we'll just introduce the other authors before ourselves even, perhaps. A big shout out to, particularly one interlocutor who can't be with us today. That's Nicole Lotz. She's not feeling very well at all today. She would have been with us on the podcast today. In addition to Nicole, we also had Elizabeth Boling, Colin Gray, and James Corazzo. So they are our fellow writers in crime. We've been engaged in this project for about 4 or 5 years, and I think over the last 4 or 5 years, I've probably spent more time with some of these individuals than my partner. It's been an interesting relationship. So my name is Derek Jones. I'm a senior lecturer in design at the Open University in the UK. We're kind of unique in that we are a distance educator. We have been offering distance education for 50 years in the United Kingdom. And that means that you have to approach design in a completely different way. But that's not where I come from. Where I originally came from is architecture. I trained to be an architect at Duncan of Jordanson in Dundee. I spent 15 years as a practicing architect, working for small practices right up to huge international practices. I've worked in loads of different kinds of buildings across multiple sectors. I've acted as a client, I've acted as a project developer, specialised in building information modelling. So I come from a practice background primarily, and I moved to the Open University because I started tutoring at the Open University. I wanted to teach maths, believe it or not. I started studying maths at the Open University and thought, that's quite clever, that's quite good how they get you to learn stuff that you didn't think you could ever learn, and there's nobody in the room with you. That's quite good. So I wanted to teach maths. I applied to be a tutor, and then I saw this job advert for design thinking, which was going to be one of the new courses at the Open University. And because I grew up in a studio, I grew up in architecture, the first thing that crosses your mind is how do you teach design at a distance? How do you teach design when you're not there with the person learning design? How does all of that tacit stuff get transferred? So I was immediately hooked by this, started teaching design at the Open University, and you very quickly realise that one of the major differences is that you have to make things visible. You're not necessarily teaching by instructing, you're still allowing people to transfer tacit knowledge, you're still allowing people to learn for themselves, but it means that you have to at least communicate at some level how design works. And for me, this was a complete revelation. 7 years of architecture education had not taught me in any way how it was that you actually operate as a designer. And by designer, I guess I should maybe define that a little bit, I suppose. I'm not necessarily meaning architect or interior designer or graphic designer. I mean that general class of individuals who apply creative thinking to make change in the world and who do it in a considered and professional or competent manner, okay? And I'd never been taught this before, and it was kind of frustrating, but also quite revelatory. So I would consider my first steps in learning to be a designer actually to be that, when I became a design educator, because that's when you have to make certain hidden things a bit more visible. So I've been obsessed with the idea of how you actually do studio at a distance for a long, long time now. And I guess that's what led to the book. I wanted to do a PhD, thought I would go to the studio, the library, sorry, the studio. Well, it could have been the studio. Picked up the book on studio, read the book on studio, and then applied it to distance and online studios and compared the two. But there was no such book. Nobody has written, if you like, a more detailed account or a comprehensive account that brings together all the different cultures, practices, things we do in order to educate people in studio, despite it being one of the oldest pedagogies in the world. There's lots of histories of it, there's lots of talk about it, but actually bringing it together in a way that you can actually say something about it in order to test something, hypothesize something, or do something a little bit more than just talk about it was actually quite difficult. And that's where studio properties came from, that slight frustration at not having a thing that defined without defining the studio. And that became the project that was Studio Matters, and then the project that became the book, which was Studio Properties. And that brings us to today, where, I also had toast for lunch, but I had jam on it.
There you go. James.
Yeah, I'm James Benedict Brown. My name is James Brown, but you can't Google that. So I'm James Benedict Brown, my full name, and I'm an associate professor of architecture at Umeå University in the north of Sweden. And Ambrose, this is where our paths rejoin after many years, because we met, I think, first at the University of Sheffield. I did my BA and my MArch at the University of Sheffield in the 2000s. And I think you joined us from Manchester or Liverpool for your master's.
Yeah, Manchester, yeah.
And I think maybe you will remember it differently, but I had a wonderful education at Sheffield in the 2000s. It was a time I came in to study architecture and had no idea what would happen, and met in pretty much the first year an incredible array of really talented teachers. In a first year program, a first year studio run by Professor Ruth Morrow, who for her sins would later end up supervising my PhD in architectural education. But it was a great time to be there with some of the older members of faculty, like Brian Lawson, who'd written the books on design thinking, and Peter Bundle-Jones, who'd introduced so many amazing European modernists to the English language canon, but then also new and emergent teachers like Prue Childs. I'm going to forget all the names of people that I want to name check at this moment, but
Leo.
also Doina Petrescu, yes, Leo Kerr, Dan Jari, who is, Aidan, and anyone who was working as a faculty member at Sheffield between 2001 and 2008 when I finished, in some way affected my education. And I took a couple of years out in between, as is common in the British way, and I spent a year in Northern Ireland working in architectural practice, and then a year in Canada doing something else, and came back to the Masters for personal reasons, and straight into the Live Project program, which is still to this day at the beginning of the first 2 years of the Masters. It's a 6-week intensive, grounded project with some basis in reality. And I happened to choose 2 live projects that, for various reasons, didn't work out as we expected. One of them was a disaster. The other one didn't quite turn out to be what I thought it was going to be. And it left an itch that I continued to scratch for a long time. I was really interested in live projects as something that occurred in architectural education quite widely in the United Kingdom, as I interpreted them as evidence of some kind of dissatisfaction with normative practices in architectural education. That really interested me, this idea that in live projects, you saw really engaged students and teachers doing something that was determinately different than what we were doing in our other courses. And I graduated in 2008, straight into a minor recession, and bummed around a bit, not finding employment, and had a couple of PhDs come my way, until the one that really grabbed me was to work with Ruth Morrow at Queen's University Belfast. And that became a PhD on live projects, a pedagogical critique of the live project as an educational initiative in architecture education. Not the first. Rachel Sara had written one in 2004 at Sheffield called Between Studio and Street. but I thought there was something more to be done. And so I did a lot of interviews with educators in Britain and Ireland and wrote that thesis. And then that led me to a career in education. And since 2012, I've been working in higher education as a lecturer and senior lecturer, deputy subject head, program leader in a couple of British universities, starting and ending in Norwich with the new BA in architecture there. And then for a couple of years at De Montfort University, Leicester, Nottingham Trent, 1 year at the Royal College in London. And then after Brexit, really seeing a lot of changes in higher education that I was not happy with anyway, and just generally pissed off at the way the cards had shaken out of Brexit, my wife and I decided to, try somewhere else. And it came down to 2 interviews that I had for 2 different jobs, one in northern Sweden and one in Australia. And pre-pandemic, as was the case, I flew to both of those job interviews. I was in Australia for about 36 hours before I came right back. And I went into those 2 interviews thinking, oh, Australia's the one. This is the one for us. This is an amazing opportunity to work with a really interesting team and to be involved in the pedagogical development of a really well-regarded university school of architecture. But then after the interviews, it kind of flipped, and this university I'd never heard of in northern Sweden, suddenly everything changed for me. And it was maybe something I'll talk about a bit later, but it was the opportunity to work in an English language environment in a Scandinavian country that was extremely rare. But also the possibility of being not in the populated south of Sweden, but the very, very sparsely populated north, in the northernmost school of architecture in Sweden and one of the northernmost in Europe, after only, I think, Reykjavik, Oulu, and maybe Tromsø. So for the last 6 years, I've been living in the sub-Arctic at 64 degrees north. And it's in that time period that I have met these amazing collaborators on this book. So Derek and I are the 2 architects. I suppose we're both recovering architects, Derek more so than me. But with Elizabeth, who's a professor of instructional design, and James, who's a senior lecturer in graphic design, and Colin, who is in human-computer interaction, and Nicole, who's got design and communication design and inclusivity in her background. We made up this coalition that met somewhat fortuitously at the start of the pandemic.
Fabulous. What a wonderful story. 2 wonderful stories. Sorry, Derek, I'm not talking out of that. So this fortuitous meeting at the start of the pandemic that generated this book. I guess my assumption is that there's a problematic that you encounter that you feel needs resolving, or is this book oriented towards a sort of justification of a model of education that is losing traction, is losing justification in the public imagination? Is there something along those lines?
Yeah, maybe I can speak to that. So when I came to Sweden in 2019, my first teaching assignment was an undergraduate unit or studio in our program. So 2nd and 3rd year students, about 40 of us, 40 students, and then me and a co-teacher, 2 teachers in the end. And started in September 2019, straight in at the deep end. And then when the COVID-19 pandemic started, like architectural educators all over the world, I had this steep learning curve of thinking, how am I going to adapt the teaching I've got planned for an online distance education? And I discovered an open meeting hosted by the EdSig, Education Special Interest Group of the Design Research Society, was happening one evening on Zoom. And, literally within hours of having installed Zoom and working out what it was, I joined this open meeting, which was being chaired by a charismatic Scottish man who was basically telling the assembled crowd of about 100 participants, people who had just signed up, don't worry, it's okay. You may be going through this sort of the 6 stages of grief. You may be coping with the sudden loss of your physical studio space, but we are here to support each other, and we're here to help each other to understand how you can teach studio not in the physical studio. And that was the beginning of a for me at the time, I was just blind panic. but it led to so many interesting meetings and conversations with teachers from all these different disciplines who share studio as their primary pedagogical means of teaching creative subjects. And at the time, I didn't think there was necessarily anything wrong with studio, to answer your question. I knew that I had to change the way I was engaging with studio to be able to be a good teacher. But as we worked on this sort of process, which was originally called the Studio Matters project, it became clear to those of us who really stuck with it and really kept on asking these questions that we were missing a handbook. We were missing a guide to studio for teachers and also for students and also for the university managers who don't understand what it is we do with these extremely expensive, labor-intensive models of teaching. And that is what became Studio Properties, the missing field guide to studio. And we call it a field guide because when you go out in the forest to pick mushrooms or to look at birds, you know what you see and you know what is around you, but you may not recognize it, and you may not know the genus or the relationships between the things you see in this environment. And in the case of mushrooms, you might not know whether that one's going to kill you or that one's going to be amazing with a little bit of butter and garlic. So we thought that the Studio Properties as a concept would be a field guide to studio that allows anyone who has an engagement in or an interest in studio to understand better what is a studio. And we don't want to define it, but we wanted to pull together the literature on studio into this missing handbook.
Derek, do you want to add anything there?
Yeah, there's quite a few things. I mean, I have to say though, first of all, I get really nervous when James compares it to a guidebook, particularly a mushroom picking guidebook, because there was that famous incident when you brought in all your mushroom picking guidebooks almost as prototypes of what the book might look like. And then 2 weeks later,
yeah, I ate some dodgy mushrooms.
You actually poisoned yourself, which is a salutary lesson. All of the stuff that's in the book, the properties that we have, each of these can be used for evil and or good. I think that's one of the strengths and one of the frustrations of studio is that it is anything and everything. That's one of the problematics of researching a space like this. It's inherently just a human space, a social space, and that means that it's anything and everything. And that to me is the central problematic, not just of studio, but of design education. I'm going to get it out of the way because it is controversial. I know that a lot of listeners will not like to hear this. I don't think it's okay to just say you can't question design, you can't question this, you can't describe this because it's tacit knowledge. I don't think that that's okay because it allows far too many bad practices to emerge. And I'm not saying that the counter is true. I'm not saying that we have to go back to a structuralist universe and say, therefore, we divide it into these bits and describe it this way. That's not true at all. I mean, again, just listen to some of your past podcasts, Ambrose. The central problematic of the 20th century was how do you move past post-structuralism? That's quite hard to say. And we've got tons of tools from the 20th century to describe things in other ways that are non-deterministic, that preserve the richness of a thing that we see in the world, while still allowing us to say something about it with a little bit more rigor, instead of having to invoke metaphysics or magic or don't ask me, you can't ask these questions. And that's what I had for the first 3 years of my architectural education was, you don't know anything about this. You have no opinion here whatsoever. You are an empty vessel to be filled via whichever orifice we wish to fill you. And that was it. And then, and takes it back to James as well, I also had Professor Ruth Morrow as a tutor in 4th year. And that opened my eyes to me having an opinion in this process and to be challenged via dialogue, questions, by what I would now consider to be good studio practice by Ruth Morrow. And it wasn't just critical inquiry, it was creative inquiry, it was cultural inquiry, it was distributed cognitive inquiry, it was all of this stuff. And that really opened my eyes to the richness and the potential of studio. And I think there are things that we can say about that richness, that wonderful thing, that preserve the wonder, as well as allow us to just talk a little bit more sensibly. So we can turn to people and say, randomness, uncertainty, or serendipity, these are not just words. These are not just terms in literature. These are actually functional characteristics, if you want to consider them functionally, that can take place in studio. And that's why we have this space. And these are the ways that you can do it. I think it's okay to do that. I think that's part of the project, is that constant. It's one of the reasons it's taken so long, and it's one of the reasons that James, as he said earlier, you might want to talk about the process itself. It's kind of like a design process. You hold multiple realities in your head at the same time, multiple sort of possibilities, and we hope, fingers crossed, that we've preserved as much of that richness as we possibly can, whilst also allowing people some pragmatic or theoretical or whatever way into that richness as possible. And that to me would be the dream. If we can get that balance and people, if it strikes a chord with people and it makes one person not have a shit experience in studio, job done for me.
No, I get that too. I'm quite interested, just to go right back to the beginning, that you've got, in the two of you, you have this diversity of experience. So obviously the online world versus, and our COVID experiences there, versus the very collaborative space, which was the Arts Tower in Sheffield, which was well cultivated, I think. Not universally used by students when I was there, certainly, but certainly a space of potential. Beautiful modernist building, open and a bit noisy, a bit messy. And I do really like that. But I guess, given that the majority of this podcast's listeners are not based in the UK, maybe we should define the spatial characteristic of what you're talking about, because I'm assuming it's not the same everywhere.
I think that's a good idea. In most of the, let's just talk about architecture for the time being, but we can maybe take it out to other design disciplines and fine art disciplines. In most of the architecture degree programs in the UK, 50% of academic credits are taken in design courses. And in fact, that's mandated it has been in the past mandated by the ARB and the Royal Institute of British Architects, that you have to take that, you have to have a program in which students learn the art of being an architect and practicing architecture in a studio environment. It was at the time that I did this, looked at this originally. I know it's changing because the validation criteria are changing in Britain. It was the only part of the RIBA's validation criteria which specified the mode of teaching. It didn't say you have to have lectures in history. It just said you have to have history and theory. But it said that you had to do at least half of the credits in a studio environment. In most established architecture schools, that means open plan environments to a greater or lesser degree. In the University of Cambridge's School of Architecture, there's a mix of rooms of interconnected terraced houses of a rather elegant terrace. In the University of Sheffield, in the Arts Tower, in this sort of modernist vision of an architecture school, purpose-built, or the spaces were purpose-built when the tower was erected. They were almost entire floor plates, apart from the circulation core, in which maybe 40, 50, 60 students would be working at desks and working on problem-based learning, on briefs that they had either been given or that they had developed themselves. So the studio is, first of all, it's an environment. It's a room or a place in a school of architecture, but it is also a pedagogical method. It's a huge framework of different pedagogies in which students take on tasks and produce their own creative work in response to those tasks, and into which teachers enter at different times to engage in conversations with students, maybe through desk crits, maybe through wall crits, or maybe through informal conversations. And it's also a space which supports peer-to-peer learning, because it's a space of visibilities where I might be working on a model or a drawing that can be seen by the students around me. But studio also has other forms. It's very often used as a shorthand for a type of course, and therefore it appears in the student's academic calendar. They might see 6 hours allocated to studio when they enroll on a course, and they see that. And so it becomes this, studio is something that bleeds across several different dimensions of the experience of being a student of architecture. It is a space, it's a period of time, it's also a state of learning. It differs around the world. In my case, I'm in a university which was keen to replicate an education on an international model. And because we teach in English, from the beginning in 2009, when the program was established, the ARB and RIBA international validation criteria were used as a framework for a possible validation, which was never fully achieved. In my case, we have a beautiful steel frame building with expansive concrete floors and 4 stories of intersecting, connected, open plan spaces where every student has a desk and they work on their respective projects, and they cluster around tutorial spaces to have conversations with their teachers or their peers. It's a beautiful space. It's a space like every architecture school I've ever visited that has awful acoustics. It's really difficult to sit and concentrate on your work because you can hear someone playing ping pong on the ground floor, and you can hear someone having an emotional breakdown on the floor above, and you can hear a tutor getting aggressive, about something over there. But it's absolutely, even though that building is really, really expensive and we're really bursting at the seams and we could use more space in a different building, perhaps, it is the first it's the characteristic of the school that my colleagues and students are the most keen to defend. It defines the atmosphere and the environment and the experience of being an architecture student.
Eric, do you think this character of architecture schools, as James has described, transfers over into practice? It's certainly absolutely, as James and you have explained, absolutely critical to our image of architecture. Does it then become the image to which practice itself is oriented? Is it that influential, or is it something unto itself?
It is a tricky question. This is one of the things that we did stop a little bit short of in the book, is the intersection between the studio for education and the studio for practice. I think definitely a lot of practices do translate quite readily, and there is some good research into this now. Studio is a bridge between education and practice. Sometimes it's a place, for example, one of our properties is that of indoctrination, enculturation, and acculturation, and that's the extent to which you replace students' existing cultures with different cultures to prepare them either for professional practice or for maybe disciplinary practices, or even just cultures of aesthetic or whatever it might be. So yes, there's definitely a lot of prep stuff that goes into the educational studio that gets taken into. I think the visibilities that we see in the professional studio, they're probably actually even more important in some of the professional studios I've worked in. It varies, and depending on, space does matter. I'm about to reject James's argument about the spatial characteristics of studio a little bit, but sometimes space does matter. So, for example, when I worked with Kepi in the UK, the Glasgow office was famously in one of the big churches in the centre of Glasgow, and there's multiple different spaces all over the building there, and that did have an impact on the teams. And that's the weird thing, is that studio, it's comprised more of other structures than spatial structures. Again, this is where I would slightly differ with James, and even just your characterization of the spatial characteristics of studio. It's the other architectures that are formed in studio that are actually more important. So, for example, the interior designers in Kepi, they would sit in the main body of the church. And to my colleagues and past colleagues in Kepis, I love you all, especially the interior designers. And I'm not going to say that one group felt better than the other, but these kind of spatial markers, if you like, and identity markers, social markers, these actually make architectures and create architectures that are actually more powerful in studio than the actual spatial characteristics themselves, to be quite honest with you. And I think a lot of that does also get translated. So you'll have your in groups, your out groups. You will still have serendipity. You will still have uncertainty and ambiguity raising its head in spaces in professional studios. And it does a lot of that because of the spatial characteristics that then support the social characteristics and the cultural stuff and the temporal stuff. So I think a lot of it does translate, But a lot of what is translated is implicit and tacit. It's not necessarily been given a name. So that's what we've been trying to do with this book, is give some of it a name. I think the next follow-on, the next natural follow-on project would be to try to apply some of this stuff in educational spaces, different educational studios, and ask the question, do we see consistency here? When is a studio not a studio? What's the boundaries of that definition? That was scary air quotes, by the way, for anybody who's just listening in audio. And similarly, what then translates to professional studios? Because for me, when you talk about the spatial characteristics of studio, and this is for me as an architect as well, I started out looking at virtual architecture compared to physical architecture. The spatial part of it, the physical part of it, is only one tiny, tiny, tiny part. Unfortunately, it's the part that we pay most attention to, but we don't even pay attention to the right parts of that, the embodied notion or the embodied aspects of the material properties of space. So I think the temporal, the social, and particularly the being in space type properties are not just as important. I think they're actually more important in most studios.
You've mentioned visibility, and I think you've touched on reflection as well, just in passing. But the way that you've written this book is that you've kind of picked out thematic clusters and identified significant characteristics which are intrinsic to the nature of design studios, or the design studio, perhaps. Visibility, as I said, reflection, iteration, identity. Can you talk perhaps a little to these topics? Maybe pick out 3 or 4 that you think are intrinsically important to the nature of studio, and perhaps also why you think that they are so significant, where they manifest, I guess, and how they can be, to go to the heart of your book, how they can be made more manifest as positive characteristics.
Yeah, and I think there's a really nice, I feel a validation in the structure of the book, because you have correctly identified that we have these clusters. Just to run them off quickly: visibilities and proximities, foundations and methods, expertise and identity, time and structures, artifacts and making, interactions and sociality, atmospheres and place, theories and knowledge, cultures and power. So they might look like they are chapters or parts of the book, but they are clusters within which there are usually 7 to 8 or 9 individual properties. They did not, we didn't actually identify those first. What happened was we set about, we wrote this book entirely at a distance from one another. We would meet for 2 hours, 2 or 3 times a week during the writing of this process on Zoom. And those Zoom blocks are broken up into 25-minute writing chunks, writing and editorial discussion chunks. And we started by identifying what we individually and then collectively through discussion thought were characteristics or properties of studio. And as they developed, they started to form relationships to one another, sort of links between them. We would start to discuss and identify patterns. And using a combination of Google Docs, where we did the most of the writing, and Miro, where we had enormous boards with little post-it notes for each property as they were progressing through the writing process, we started to visualize these connections as clusters. And through a process of iteration, the clusters formed around them. And there were certainly properties that moved clusters, and there were properties that fell out and that we abandoned, that we didn't take forward. So in the book, some of my favorite, I think, are ones that directly speak to experiences that I had as a student. We actually have a property about critical pedagogy because, as Derek has hinted, we both have this shared background in a feminist, progressive studio environment where critical pedagogy was a foundational facet of the studio. But I think others on place and informalities and serendipity, I think around the cluster around atmospheres and place was really interesting for me as it emerged, because it was able to give name to some of the things I remember feeling as a student in studio and seeing in studio, and then linking to the literature. We have a bibliography of, I think, 751 or 2 texts that explain and give scientific reference to all of these properties. So I think that's where I'd suddenly written certain chunks of the book and then found myself drawn to bits written by my collaborators. And then, we've sort of swapped and handed them back and forth. I know Derek has his favorites as well. And we're starting to write sort of blog entries about them on our website, studioproperties.org.
Definitely. Yeah, I'll maybe throw a couple at you, Ambrose, that kind of hint at what I was talking about before in terms of spatiality not necessarily being, the only primary major attribute, if you like, of studio. And this comes from my experience of operating studios in a distance and an online environment. I see no distinction between the architectures that you'll see in a physical or proximate studio and in an online studio. The difference is understanding, and I guess maybe this is where I come from as an architect, and maybe as James says, it comes from, I suppose, where I was trained and by whom I was trained to be an architect. It's because I understand the architecture of both these places to be a conception. It's a construction in the mind. It's a recreation of that architecture by people in space or people online in temporal space, still co-concepting the same thing or a similar thing. So, for example, sitting round about a table coming up with ideas, the architecture that's created in that moment, in that place, in that interaction can happen just as well in an online space as it can in a physical space, as long as you treat the two different modes appropriately for what it is that you're trying to do. So the couple that I'll give you as examples would be time. It's just a really, really simple thing, but in studio, time operates in lots of different ways, and not just because time is there and it's a function of space or whatever it might be, but that the different rhythms in the studio allow different architectures to emerge. So, for example, we've had to invent the phrase, and this comes from online and distance teaching. We don't just have synchronous and asynchronous meetings. So we're having a synchronous meeting right just now. We are all here at the same time or in different places at the same time, and that's pure synchronicity. But we've also had semi-synchronous discussion about this up to the event. And I won't go into detail about the planning and the pre-planning that's gone into this particular episode. It was quite amusing, but that's a semi-synchronous event because at some point we know that it had to take place or hit this particular deadline. And that happens in studio all the time. You'll have a weekly rhythm or a project rhythm. That means that people are not necessarily there exactly at the same time, but roughly at the same time. And that type of proximity is actually a temporal proximity that is just as important in architecture as well as in studio, okay? You know that patients have been in a hospital. You know that other people have operated in a building. And that layering, if you like, of temporality is quite important because the clues that people have been there matters. Another example of that would be the way that privacy operates. Again, another lovely one that we shamelessly borrowed from some of my urban design books is the notion of public, semi-private, and private, and how those kind of architectures emerge in studio. Keeping your work private in your drawer or semi-private on your desk. You're okay for some people to see it, but not other people to see it. And one way that some students create architectures of privacy is to use time. They will come in at 5 o'clock and work to 9 o'clock, or they'll come in very late so that other people, or maybe even certain people, are not in studio. They're creating different architectures for themselves with the same space. And it's those kind of other things, those kind of things that you say to somebody and they'll go, yeah, that happens all the time. And our point is, yes, it happens all the time, but some people don't know that. And giving it a name, saying that this is, rhythm, this is time, or this is the variable of privacy or whatever it is, to say this is an important aspect of studio. It's not just that people go into studio and they learn architecture or they learn design. It's how they do that that matters as well. Being able to talk about that as an educator, as an administrator, to justify space, to justify what studio is doing, and also to justify just how much studio costs in an online space as it does in a spatial, physically co-located space. That's also important. If you don't have that language, you can't even argue it because you're talking to somebody who doesn't understand studio, who doesn't know it because they have not been through it.
Do you think that there is something of specific value to design as distinct from other types of learning about the studio? Because some of these themes that you seem to be picking out, like visibility and collaboration, seem to me to have sort of a general kind of value. For example, the educational classroom at primary and secondary level, junior and high school level, also has those characteristics. Like I remember, funnily enough, actually, doing a live project in my first year of the Bachelor of Architecture, the diploma at Sheffield, we were developing a classroom for a school in Chesterfield, which is in Derbyshire. And the teacher said he sat a boy next to a girl. These were about 11-year-olds. So he'd sit a boy next to a girl because boys are very precocious, but immature, and girls are a bit more anxious, but more mature. Rather simplistic, but that's how he organized his classroom. And therefore they would demonstrate to each other through this visibility, through this characteristic. So I'm just wondering if there's some specific value here to the process of designing and design thinking development that these things have.
Yeah, I'll maybe jump in just before James comes in on this, perhaps, because, well, first of all, I have to identify my positionality here. I work at the Open University. I literally have the office that Nigel Cross used to work in at the Open University. So from Nigel Cross right back to Bruce Archer, way back in the 1950s at the RCA, trying to establish design as, if you like, a third discipline between the arts and science. And that comes off the back of, predecessors, the sciences of the artificial, and so on and so forth. That there is a different form of knowledge that is not quite the arts, not quite science, that is the knowledge through changing the world, whether it's through technology, whether it's through making, whether it's through design. If you're pitching it at that level, designed to be defined at that level, it's not really a discipline anymore. It's like saying that science is a discipline. It's not. Biology, even biology isn't a discipline anymore. Cellular biology is the discipline within, I don't know, an exegesis, a culture, a church of knowledge, or some other kind of fundamental way of understanding how you operate knowledge. So in that sense, Ambrose, I would say, yes, there's a massive, massive, massive overlap between just human education, the way that two people might relate to one another. Apprenticeship is one of the core theories behind why Studio A exists. That's just a really human thing to do. I don't like to use the phrase hardwired, but it's one of the things that we are cognitively hardwired to do, which is to learn through observation, particularly social observation. So yes, it's absolutely going to work in a classroom environment, Ambrose. I would maybe flip it and say, is it not the other way, or the other way to think about this is that we are almost underutilizing Studio as a mode and as a pedagogy. And again, now that we've got a book that can actually describe some of the properties of it, there are some little detailed specifics for every single aspect that you've just described that are slightly more unique to either design or, even better, to some of the sub-disciplines in design. So, for example, what you've just described there is a suite of social cognitive learning mechanisms that are round about social comparison. Goes back to Fessinger's experiments way back in the 60s, I believe. And it's only just recently that we've actually updated some of those theories at the Open University by looking at how students compare themselves to work of other students. Our studios are huge. We'll have thousands of students in a single studio. So when you're designing a T-shirt, you're looking at potentially hundreds of other students' work, and how students actually construct a social definition of what is a good T-shirt, never mind what is a good comparison, how they actually conduct comparison does take place slightly differently in design. I'm not going to get into the details of that. If anybody wants to talk about it or read about it, get in touch. I love talking about it, and that's why I'm not going to talk about it. But I can't explain that, Ambrose, looking at the evidence without also invoking some subtle differences that only happen in design processes in those kind of constructivist modes.
James, you did want to say something here.
We're all architects here, and I imagine the majority of the listeners to this podcast are architects too. And I think one of the most enriching experiences I've had through this process is to suddenly be jolted out of not only the silo that I find myself in, but also this disciplinary sort of the blinkers that I was wearing, having been in architecture education, either as a student or a teacher, for now going on 25, 24 years this year. Because especially in Umeå, where we teach in English, I'm one of only, I think, 2 or maybe 3 native mother tongue English speakers in our department. So when we have meetings and we talk about studio or research or seminars or anything like that, I'm in the privileged position of not having to work through my second language to get there, unless I'm having the meeting in Swedish. And it makes it very obvious sometimes that when we use words that are very common in our discipline, like lecture or studio or crit, we have not only our disciplinary, but also our cultural and social assumptions about what those things are. My hope with the book is that it's going to be read by a very wide audience of people who have some interaction in studio in their own fields, and that they're maybe going to take from it something that we haven't yet seen. And I think this discussion that Derek has expanded on about what design is will probably be one of the most intense points of that process, because there are, hundreds of thousands of people in the United Kingdom and in the European Union and millions around the world of people who are involved in the creative industries in some kind of design role, where they use skills that they've learned in an environment like this to apply design thinking and design processes to problem solving and to generating new ideas. And it has come to my awareness by doing this that we in architecture tend to use a very, very narrow range of those. In normative architectural education, we don't really push the boundaries very far about what we think design can be, because we're so locked in our way of thinking. For my part, I had quite good advice some years ago by someone who I trusted, who advised me. There's this sort of common idea in academia: you need to find your niche and then climb into the niche and then defend it with all your energy. Stop anyone else writing a book on your subject. You've got to be first and you've got to defend that corner. But as an educator, what I was recommended and has proven very fruitful to me is to not be pigeonholed as either a design studio educator or a history and theory lecturer, let's say, because I predominantly teach history and theory now, but I'm also starting a new design build summer course this year, and I have taught studio. I've taught pretty much every one of the miniature silos in architectural education, and studio as a form and a process of thinking bleeds across all of them. And it has actually made me a better giver of lecturers and a better giver of tutorials and seminars and workshops in the different parts of the architectural education.
I'm sure it has, James. I mean, listening to you is making me feel like a very unreflexive educator.
We accept international students. I'm afraid it'll be a non-EU fee, but you're very welcome to join us.
Yeah, for sure. I did write in my notes to you, I did put down that I wanted to talk about the crit, but I actually want to come to penultimate point, really. I'm going to skip over the crit because it's too easy. It's like, for me, it's like shooting fish in a barrel. It's very weird, by the way, in my opinion. But I wanted to ask a bit more about this idea that, Derek, you've mentioned earlier, which is this kind of the hidden curriculum and what it is, which I think is one of the kind of critical points that flows through the book. This idea that there are these forces at play that facilitate productive uses of studio design learning. And I can remember back to my undergraduate, no one used the studio. It wasn't really set up to be used. And there was this strange atmosphere of competitiveness that then emerged on review day, where people would show up with virtually unseen work. I mean, the tutors had seen it on their tutorial days, but tutorials, you got your time and you turned up and then you left afterwards. So there was this complete blindness to actually what your colleagues were doing. So it was very, very tense and very unpleasant. And likewise at Sheffield, there were some of us who worked in studio, but it wasn't universal. And again, that same thing happened where you had a form of hiddenness. And obviously post-COVID, we've seen this emerge again, where my experience of the studio has been radically transformed by a reluctance of students to be in each other's company, not for fear of microbes or whatever, but out of some sort of social anxiety based around the sharing of space and the possibility of critique, possibly more formed actually than by COVID, has been formed by social media and the ideas of perfectionism that are promulgated, leveraged, monetized by social media companies. So I was wondering about this idea of the hidden curriculum, and maybe you could explain that a little bit more. And then I suppose, most importantly, how do we transcend these things? What techniques have you seen and have you developed that help us move beyond these impediments, these barriers to access?
So and particularly that last part is a really, really important way into this as a problem. What I'm going to do first, though, is just quickly distinguish between some hidden aspects of studio and hidden curriculum. Hidden curriculum is quite a particular thing. Um, I'm not going to talk too much about it because I think Colin Gray, one of our co-authors, this is definitely his bag. He sees it very much as part of a kind of critical pedagogy and it's a response, if you like, to almost like a Freirean, Paulo Freire, his notion of curriculum that oppress or curricula that oppress. So it's a structure, if you like. I think I'll maybe draw attention just really quickly to some of the other hidden things because sometimes that can be sometimes it can work fantastically well. So, for example, if you'd had a slightly different experience, Ambrose, so for example, my experience in fourth and fifth year in architecture in Dundee, we were always in studio all the time because it was such a good crack. We had really good lecturers. We would talk about anything. We used to run our own seminars and do all kinds of like weird stuff that I probably should not talk about just now. I nearly told you a story that I shouldn't tell you. And we were lucky in that sense. But that's us just using the same spatial volume as, say, the year before us that had a completely different experience. So it's like a party. How do you plan to have a good party? And one of the responses is you kind of can't. It does have to be constructed. And that's part of what good creative and design education is about. It's constructivist. That is, it's not just us saying this is how you design something, it's how people actually construct the ways in which they are going to become designers. And if you move from instruction, if you move from that notion of giving students the right sorts of opportunities to construct for themselves their own experiences to become learners, then you move to a system of instruction. And it's almost as if what you're describing, Ambrose, is more of an instructive system. And if I was to look at all the properties in our book, I was just thinking about it as you were describing it. I'm thinking, nope, can't take that, can't take that, can't take that. I don't think it would come up with many properties out of that book. I'll give you a quick example of this, though, on the kind of social anxiety stuff. And this is why it matters. This is why planning your slots for crits and only allowing one person to come into the studio at one time doesn't work for certain types, unless somebody knows more about the pedagogy of learning to fail than I do, which is fine. I'm happy to accept that. But is it based on knowledge of learning how to fail? I doubt it very much. We don't understand sometimes how it is that people learn. We're not necessarily educators first and foremost. We actually have probably three roles as design practitioners, as kind of tutors, which is not the same as being an educator. So when it comes down to actually learning about failure, how a student learns that failure is actually a positive thing in their life, in their creative world, as opposed to what they've been taught for the last 14 years, which is that they need to succeed and avoid failure. How you actually teach that, how you actually allow that to be learned, you need to know how to do that. You can't just keep exposing people to failure and saying, no, that's it, not it, that's not it. You need to actually have some kind of pedagogical chops behind you to actually understand how you build up tolerance to failures. And one of the best ways to do it is through social comparison. But you don't then put a whole bunch of people in the same room and get them to stand up individually, show their failures, and sit down with a red face and on the verge of tears. That's not the right way to do it either. So again, what the book identifies is all the different research that shows that that's not a good way to do it, and here are other ways to do it. The book does stop short, I'll be quite honest with you. It does stop short in actually saying what you should do. At no point do we ever say, this is a better thing to do, this is a worse thing to do. We really try to stick to the evidence. And this is one of the areas where I think we could do with a lot more work in. So things like all the attitude stuff, like failure, uncertainty and ambiguity, all of these things that are difficult to learn because you can't learn them. You can only be exposed to them and find your own ways to approach them. We need better understandings as educators, how we can actually encourage that in students. So yeah, I'm beginning to repeat myself and waffle a bit there. I think studio offers the opportunity to do that, but unless you're engaged in it as an educator who knows the different ways that you can go about that, you're not going to operate it as a studio. You can call it a studio, but it won't be one unless you're actually bringing those other opportunity spaces to bear.
What do you reckon, James?
I have to, I put my hands up. I had a pretty good COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, I got sick a couple of times, but I had just got the keys to a farmhouse in the middle of the forest. And it turned out that the municipality had just laid the fastest fiber broadband link in the county, down our gravel road a few years earlier. So I had a good pandemic, and I was really interested talking to the students then and now much later on who actually preferred that learning. For many of us, it was a crisis of like losing everything that we thought was certain and solid. But for some students, it gave them back agency and control over the interactions they had with other students and their teachers. Sure, it was an intrusion into their home life, and for very few people was that okay. It wasn't really good for me to have Zoom sessions and see into, ironically, the studio apartments of my students, the one room where everything was on show in the background. But for some students with disabilities, students with learning differences, there were certain affordances that teaching digitally gave them, which they had never experienced in their secondary education or in their, what little experience they'd had of architecture school before that moment happened. And right now on my bedside table is Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness. It's a very accessible book. It's an American book, and it speaks primarily to the American experience. But it's fascinating because it is a very powerful reminder that the students we're meeting today in studio had a completely different experience, a completely different path to higher education than we experienced. Haidt sort of pins it as, I've got to get this right, he perceives, especially in North America, but also in many other parts of the world, and he has statistics that shows it's the same in Scandinavia. We're not exempt. That from the 90s, starting in the 1990s and then into the 2000s, parenting changed, and we first of all became extremely afraid of children being autonomous and playing out in the real world. We started to put fences up and boundaries on their freedom and got afraid of, them coming to harm when they played away from the oversight of their parents. So they had this massive limitation on their freedom in those important years as children when they were playing. But then social media arrives, and they have this complete lack of supportive controls in an online world where they're exposed to a front-facing camera, which not only takes a photograph but then allows you to fine-tune it and edit it before you share it with everyone else. And because he identifies that in the current generation of teenagers and the people we're now meeting in university was a really quite, in some cases, traumatic experience of childhood in which they didn't have the possibility to develop as autonomous individuals. And at the same time, we're having to deal with all the anxiety that is brought about by social media and technology, making it possible to communicate. And it's not all bad news. Our students who are coming into the university today are, I think, much more sophisticated at defining the environment that they feel is productive and supportive for them. And they're much more not just good at using technology, they can use it in ways that we couldn't even foresee to sort of collaborate and to network and to share ideas. And they do it seamlessly. Whereas, Derek and I had to go downstairs 2 floors and along the corridor to go into a room to turn on a computer. That connection between the digital and the proximate, or those aren't opposites, but between the proximate world and the non-proximate world is much closer. This is also calling forward to what I think will be my next project, which is a book more in the realm of history and theory, which was brought about when a really good colleague of mine gave a lecture, and he started with a photograph of the Twin Towers and one of the planes hitting the towers, and he sort of wanted to grab the urgency of the moment we're in the last 25 years. And, we are living in these very uncertain times with climate change, political instability, even political backsliding, and crisis. And he pointed to this picture and he says, this was a defining moment for our generation. We all know where we were when this happened. And he had to be reminded afterwards that we're still defining our worldview on what happened on 9/11 and 2001. Our students aren't. They're very much like the the born free generation in South Africa. They're a generation, we're constantly a generation or two behind where our students are. And I think that when we talk about the student experience of design education in the university, we struggle to keep up with their worldview and their experience. That's something I want to do more about in the future. And it starts by, starting every single course, not only with going around the table and introducing yourself, but trying as much as possible to define what their expectations and needs are. And that takes a little bit of time. It's not something it's as simple as saying, write down on a Post-it note and put it on the wall. It's something that we as teachers have to be responsive to. And again, plugging the book and its open access availability to all. I hope that this is a book that gives every reader something somewhere which helps them to have a better relationship with Studio as a learning environment. And hopefully they'll come back to us and tell us about it in the future.
It's kind of, I think, useful to think about the meta-narrative that sits behind these discussions around the value of Studio as well. There's something in it about Studio culture, the Studio practice as a good, I think, is the thing that I would draw from what you're saying. That for me, I try and encourage students to work in Studio because my experience at Sheffield was one of, as you say, James, great joy and creativity, but also just friendship. And that part of Studio culture and Studio learning, that idea of a learning through the osmosis of friendship is, I think, really critical. I just wanted to finish on whether you had any further reflections or ask you a little bit about the nature of this book. You've talked, I think, very elegantly about this kind of laying out using Miro and these meetings. What do you feel specifically this kind of critical writing practice as scholars? What do you feel this brings? Does it bring a certain new form of insight? Is it a way that you would reapproach and reuse again, or is it a kind of an experimental thing born of an experimental project?
I think I remember the first meeting we had after we'd finished the manuscript, and there was a sort of emptiness in the room. It's like, oh, what do we do now? It's kind of, can we just hang around and chat for a bit? It was in the pandemic years, it was a support mechanism, but it was most thrilling to be in a Google Doc and to see one or two other colored cursors working on the same text. I'd had that experience quite early, I think in the late 2000s. I remember using one of the very first cloud-based word processing apps. And after years of being a student kind of on my own with the writing assignments, we may collaborate in Studio, but writing always tended to be, even if you shared it with an author, you would write something, print it, hand it over, or email it. It was very, very rewarding to be in this esteemed company where different people could write something and then very quickly edit or change it. And we continue to do that with our conference papers. We're touring the book this year and we're taking it to conferences, and we continue to write like that. And I think that is how I would like to write in the future. Luckily in Sweden, you don't get penalized for co-authoring something with someone in the same institution as you used to in the UK with the ref. So I'm going to try and do more of that. And that's how some of my other recent books have been done. They've been collaborations, largely digital, with co-authors. And I think that's for academics, that is, there's no going back. That's the way we work now, because there's no difference now between writing and peer review. If you're writing with a partner, you're always questioning every word as they appear on the screen. But that's not also to downplay the beauty of the book itself. We've been very lucky to have members of the team who have been able to get funding, and we've all contributed some of our own either funding or personal funding to design the book. So AWAR Studio in Sheffield have done a beautiful job of this book. It looks amazing as an ebook, and I think it's going to look beautiful as a paperback. And it's going to be open access as well. And I think that's something that I'm really, really excited about.
Yeah, I think I would probably echo everything James said, and maybe just to summarize it, maybe it's because as you get older, you do get a bit lazier. So maybe this is where the confluence of disciplines comes from me. I mean, I see very little difference in some ways between being an architect, being a designer, being an educator. I think that you bring as much of a practitioner's attitude to education as you do to sort of design practice. I mean, for me, the writing process was a studio. I think we did run a studio. I think we're possibly still running a studio. If we had time, Ambrose, or if this was a visual podcast, we could show you some of the Miro boards that we have, including the vending machine, which was the peer review process that we had. We could show you the rejected properties, the temporal bun fights we had over whether properties should be or not be included. So yeah, for me, it was a studio process. And again, this is where the laziness comes in. The more I know about how education works, it just turns into just this human practice. And being a good educator, I'm not going to say it's about being a good human, because that doesn't necessarily mean anything, but it means that you're more aware, if you like, of just how human and messy and dirty and filthy and filled with bacteria, water, these sort of activities kind of are. And that's not a critique on my fellow authors. But we had to take a lot of time to build up the atmosphere in that studio in order to get to the level of trust required in order to be able to write over each other's words. And again, if you have that positive experience in a studio education environment and you find your own network, your own group of peer students, or your own sort of students and a tutor relationship, when that works really well, man, does that make a difference to your experience, to your learning, to your development. So yeah,
indeed. It's a great point to finish on. Thank you very much, Derek. Thank you very much, James. Really lovely to speak with you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for your time, Ambrose. Great to have a chat.
Thank you.
All good nights out end with Cheerios. All good hip-hop ends in studios. So said great Hull-based rapper Choppy Wotsits. In a perhaps rather too rare moment of insight, he might have been talking of architecture. He was, in fact, talking about an argument he'd had with someone from Grimsby. In any case, it's very relevant here. Thanks to James and Derek for taking the time to speak with me, and to them and their co-authors for the wonderful book. Please see the podcast description for links to the book, and to James and Derek's professional and social profiles where I've been able to find them. And thanks for listening.